Hello and welcome to Solomoriah Speaks, Episode 12, The Origin of the Iron Falcon Role-Playing Game. The Iron Falcon Rules for Classic Fantasy Role-Playing is a retro-clone game that I wrote back in 2014. I told the story of how and why I created it in bits and pieces here and there. You could reconstruct it from the original forum posts online, they're still there. Or I've told the whole story in a few private conversations, but I have really never told the story coherently, and I think there's a few misconceptions and a lot of curiosity about it. So I'm going to try to cover all that today. Before I get started on that, let me just tell you what the game is. What is Iron Falcon? Right off the back of the book. The Iron Falcon rules for classic fantasy role-playing reproduce, with the highest possible degree of faithfulness, the mechanics of the role-playing campaigns from the very early days of the hobby. The material presented herein is as close to those early campaigns created by the founders of the hobby as possible, with all the magic and glory intact. Iron Falcon presents those classic game mechanics in a clear and concise fashion in the form of this single book. These rules are just the sort of loose framework they were always meant to be, but now logically organized and easily used as a reference. So that's Iron Falcon. One of my goals, to digress briefly, in creating Iron Falcon was to replicate the game mechanics of the early era, the first version of the game that I would describe as recognizable by modern players as being the actual game. Was to replicate the game's mechanics and to keep its vagueness while removing its uncertainty. There are many places in those old rules where you'd be reading along and you have no idea what they're talking about. And you'd have to read it a half dozen times or ask friends for explanations. And there are places that the information you really do need to know is just plain missing. I have attempted to fill in the blanks as much as possible there, but places where the game was intentionally vague to leave it to the game master's decision have been left that way. It is up to the game master to decide how things look and feel in their own world. And this game completely supports that. So that's Iron Falcon. But to understand why I created Iron Falcon, you need to know a little bit about the creation of my other game, Basic Fantasy. Basic Fantasy role-playing game was released originally, the very first, very sketchy release 6. The first release I actually publicly shared as opposed to ones I shared privately in February of 2006. So coincidentally, 8 years before I started in on Iron Falcon. Basic Fantasy RPG intended to replicate the era I started, 1981, the era I started in role-playing games. It was an intention to replicate the way I played the game, the way I ran the game back then, more so than to replicate the actual game of the era. And there were things that I had never liked in the old game that I did change. I would have used Ascending AC from the very beginning if I'd ever thought of it. But what person coming to RPGs with no prior knowledge would ever think of something different like that? I didn't. There are elements of the game now that I just, I couldn't imagine back then. But I wondered even back then, the other thing, why a halfling or a dwarf could only basically be a fighter. There were no clerics or thieves among them. I got a little bit that they weren't magical, just as I got that elves were. But why couldn't an elf just be a magic user? Why did they have to also be a fighter? Why couldn't they just be a fighter and not be a magic user? Or maybe they want to be a cleric also. Aspects of the game that I didn't like at the time, I did change when I started creating Basic Fantasy. I created a game that would play the way I wanted it to play, or the way I believed I wanted it to play at the time. I kept the game compact. I stayed away from adding a bunch of new stuff. While I did change some core expectations, I kept away from adding new races or classes, expanding the magic items dramatically, expanding the monsters dramatically. I added a few monsters. None of this is really very critical. The main thing is that in 2006, when I released the game, 2007 when it went to print, in that time frame I was the first visible in public. Other games may have been in development earlier, but they were being developed privately. But by 2007, late 2007, 4 old school role-playing games were in print at the time. Basic Fantasy, Osric, Swords and Wizardry, and Labyrinth Lord. At that time, the term used to describe our games was retroclone. And it's all in the name. A clone of a retro and an old game. A clone of an old game, a retro clone. And that was us. We were the retro clones. For that period of time, before the term old school Renaissance had ever been coined, before there was an OSR, we were there. Before us, there were a couple of other games that attempted to replicate the mechanics or the feel or both of the old games. One did that by being a parody. Another did that by replicating the look and feel, but by using a modern unified mechanic. Neither of those were the games I really wanted to play. There's nothing wrong with them. They're perfectly fine games. If somebody else wanted to be game master them for me, I would be happy to jump in. But for the games I wanted to run as a game master, they were not what I wanted, and that's why I wrote Basic Fantasy. Basic Fantasy is a true open source game. Many people have collaborated, contributed, and so forth to the project. But that was how things were in 2007. Fast forward 7 years to 2014. Sometime in January of 2014, in a conversation I don't remember, I was led to read the Wikipedia article about retroclone games. And I discovered, much to my annoyance and surprise, that Basic Fantasy was listed as not being a retroclone. In the 7 years, well, 8 years since Basic Fantasy was first released, it had gone from being a retroclone to not being a retroclone, and that happened because the goalposts moved. The definition used by Wikipedia at the time, I haven't read it recently, so I don't know what it currently says, but the definition being used at the time was that a retroclone game had to be a game that cloned a specific edition of the classic game to a relatively high degree of fidelity or faithfulness. And Basic Fantasy didn't. I separated race and class. I used ascending AC. There were a few other changes. Those are the big ones. Those are the two primary things that caused the game to get kicked out of the retroclone party at the time. And yeah, I was a little annoyed by this. It was a club I had helped to found. And now I find myself on the outside. I made the comment in the past that I wrote Iron Falcon out of spite, and a few people who've heard me say that or have seen that in print have thought I meant something more serious than I did. I was not raging angry. I was not red in the face, or my eyes weren't bulging. I wasn't making fists. But I wasn't happy about it. I certainly wasn't happy to see that I no longer seemed to qualify as a retroclone author because I had chosen to change a few things. Without getting into details that would probably be an OGL violation, I can tell you that there are many other games that are accepted as retroclones that differ in what some gamers might consider significant ways. But they're still accepted as retroclones. I'm not here to judge that. Somebody else has set themselves up to judge that. But I was annoyed by it. It was frustrating. As it happened, several times in the past, I had attempted to study and learn the versions of the game that preceded the version I started with in 1981. And while I had succeeded, I feel like, I was a game master for an advanced game back in the day, if that means anything to you, but not recently. But I never could really grasp the first versions of the game. But I did notice looking that here in 2014, no one had ever cloned the first version of the game published that could throw off its wargaming roots and be the game that we recognize, with the basic classes and the basic races and the standard things that we expected to see in the game at that time, from that time forward. So I decided that was my goal. Now, there were games that targeted an earlier era with varying degrees of accuracy, and there were games targeting later eras with varying degrees of fidelity, but no one had really gone for that spot. So I chose that spot let's call it 1975. And I took my understanding, my grasp of it, and I started, studying and trying to figure out what the mechanics actually were. And I started releasing versions there at the beginning of February of 2014. Several people jumped in and helped me. Not in the sense of collaborating. I don't have any collaborators. No one else wrote any materials that appears in the book besides me, other than any little bits I made of bars in the SRD, and they're pretty small. But I had several people who gave me commentary about how closely I was staying to the mechanics, whether I had gotten too close, and helped me to understand the things I did not understand. There was a major piece of the game I just did not get at all that Simon Bull clarified for me. I'm going to call him out by name. Simon was invaluable in helping me understand. I've mentioned him before in another video. Helping me understand that era and what made it the way it was. Simon is one of the two authors of the Delving Deeper RPG, which targets before 1975, let's say 1974. And there's a distinct line between the two. I can only suggest that you go take a look at it. It uses definitely a more wargamey system of combat. It's cool. It's not the game I want to run, but I'd play it if somebody wanted to run one. But at any rate, he helped me understand. He helped me to make decisions about what really needed to be done. And so he particularly helped me with that distinction between uncertainty and vagueness. There were several places where I put nails in things that I shouldn't have nailed down, and he pointed it out to me, and I fixed it. And I appreciate that. He's credited in the book for just that purpose. But I wrote it. I wrote the game from scratch. That was my plan. And furthermore, I wrote it, almost all of it, within a month. I was on fire. It was February. What else was I going to do? It's Missouri. It's cold and icy and nasty outside. So, I wasn't playing outside. So I was definitely inside writing rules. Now, I talk about getting disqualified from being a retro clone. I have no question in my mind that Iron Falcon is definitely a retro clone. I'm not going to go back and look at Wikipedia. I really never did care. It wasn't their opinion as much as it was the opinions of people that I knew who were in the gaming community. I don't want to say business, the gaming community, who agreed with their premise, with their definition. And I wanted to be what I had been. I wanted to be a retro clone author, so I wrote Iron Falcon. Iron Falcon differs in a couple of fairly minor details that no one has complained about. But it differs in one detail. The old game, the game of that era, allowed a half-elf NPC to be a cleric, but did not allow player character half-elves to be clerics. And I allowed it. And I swear, I had one guy who came into the forum and told me that there was no way that my game qualified as a retro clone. I had failed. I had committed some kind of sin. I forget exactly what he said, but it sounded pretty serious. I've been waiting for the retro police to come and haul me off ever since. So, as I say, you can't please everyone. But I feel like Iron Falcon is just as close as it can get to that game of that era and still be legal, be acceptable. And it is definitely, I wrote almost every word in the book. Outside of the things that I had to include a bit and piece here and there from the SRD. That's actually what caused one of the issues with nailing something down I shouldn't have nailed down. I copied a very small amount of descriptive text of one spell, and Simon called that out immediately, and he said, this limits the game master's interpretation of this feature of this spell. And I'm like, oh, hadn't even noticed. But he was right, and I did go back and I did actually remove that and wrote my own version. So that's it. That's why I created it. Yeah, technically I did create it out of spite, but I wasn't really angry at anyone in particular. I was a little frustrated at the time, and I had a month on my hands and a game I wanted to understand. That's probably the main thing I got out of it. Now, Having said that, Iron Falcon is available for sale. It is not nearly as popular as Basic Fantasy. There's lots of reasons for that, and I'm not surprised. It is not an era that a lot of people are targeting, so in there, probably why there wasn't a retro clone of it at the time when I wrote it. But there are people that are fans of it. I do have 2 books coming out, hopefully this year for it. One is the Iron Falcon Handbook of Monsters. I've got a very preliminary version of it here with Al Cook's cover art on it. That is some gorgeous stuff, I have to say. I love Al's work. The Handbook of Monsters is going to provide every standard monster that is not product identity. Where I can, I'm providing look-alike or work-alike monsters, mostly work-alike, let's say. Monsters to fill in the ecological niches that the unacceptable monsters filled in. Just as every retro clone author does. But my intention is to cover every standard monster that would have appeared in adventure modules up until about 1980. I found writing adventures for Iron Falcon was actually limiting. Many monsters I expected to be there just weren't there. I commented on this before. Because they hadn't been invented yet in 1975, and I targeted 1975. So by adding a few years on, expanding my target range, I'm going to have something to fill in the blank for basically everything, something to go everywhere. The Handbook of Monsters will also include an expanded treasure table to accommodate monsters that had treasures that just weren't found in the original Iron Falcon or the original game that Iron Falcon replicates. And an expanded experience point table for Iron Falcon use to cover the higher hit die monsters that were just calculated in the Iron Falcon book. So that's the Handbook of Monsters. The second publication I am not going to name yet. I have we'll call it an adventure series / campaign world that a few people have play tested. It has been uniformly popular, more than I expected, in fact, among the people that I have run it for. But I have to admit, you probably need a committed group of players because it's not going to be one where you're going to want to rotate people in and out a lot. There you go. Still, I'm pretty proud of it. I am keeping it under wraps as much as possible. But it's my hope that by late this year, I will be able to, in time for Christmas of 2022, it's my hope to be able to release both the Handbook of Monsters and that book at the same time and get them out there for the public, for you guys to get into and play. One of the complaints about Iron Falcon is that it does use descending AC. And like I said, I would have used ascending AC back in 81 if I'd ever thought of it. I've said that many times. And the same thing applies to Iron Falcon. It has descending AC. I did not change that. I kept that the same. But it's not hard to write a table for attack bonuses to change Iron Falcon over to be an ascending AC system using the same math as Basic Fantasy. The new publication will include some information on doing that, along with several other optional rules that are necessary for that campaign world. Things that, well, I won't say necessary, some of them are necessary, that are maybe desirable for this other campaign world that I'm going to provide. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope that it all goes well. I hope that everyone likes it. I'm not turning my back on Basic Fantasy. We have a revision to the original field guide, the Basic Fantasy Field Guide, and the second field guide, Volume 2. Hopefully we'll get those out in the next few months. We keep closing in on a release for the second field guide, but we just haven't quite gotten there yet, and I'm wanting to synchronize them if I can. So those should be coming out later this year, probably not as late as the Iron Falcon publications. We have CS2, The Dark Temple, which should be coming out hopefully in the next few months. I am really, really proud of it. I have not gotten to play test it as much as I did CS1. I designed the maps for both of those contest series modules, specifically so that they would fit on my battle mats for use at conventions, and has ruined that. Basically, I've not been to a convention in several years, kind of missing it. Hopefully soon, but who knows? I'm not going to discuss that anymore for fear that YouTube will decide I'm talking about stuff I don't know about. I'll try to stick to talking about things I do know about. But the main thing is that I haven't gotten to playtest CS2 as much as I would like. So we will probably be releasing it a little less playtested than I would have preferred. I'm interested if anyone who is a community member who's run any of the adventures in CS2 would like to submit a playtest report. We'll put you and your players in the playtesters list. We will definitely take your concerns, considerations into consideration. Your problems, whatever you've seen that seems to be wrong or difficult about any of the adventures, anything you just think could be improved, let us know on the forum. We'd be happy to hear from you. But it's my intention to see CS2, the second field guide volume, the revision of the first field guide volume, all in print this year, along with the 2 books for Iron Falcon. It's going to be a busy year. I think that covers everything. Thanks for listening, and hope you'll get to hear from us again next week.